hardest piece is that we have to learn how to live.
I'm sorry?
We have to learn how to live. The basic issue is that this is a society based on conquest, not on survival. This is a society which consumes a third of the world's resources. This is a society which is out of order with the natural world. We have to get into order. That in itself, a just total elimination of the consumption of other people's resources is essential to everybody's survival.
Welcome to the Eco-Politics Podcast, Season 4, The Politics of the Anthropocene. This is the second episode in our two-part series on the growth environment debate, which is based on Ryan's recently published book, The Growth Environment Debate, an Introduction. You can get that book at a bookseller of your choice. And if you haven't heard part 1, we recommend going back and doing that before you dive into this one. So Ryan, in part 1, we discussed how there were 5 main discourses in your book, each one with its own generalized response to this question about the true relationship between growth and environment. We began by discussing the rise of the debate in the context of the Limits to Growth report from the 1970s. And then we introduced the growth is green discourse, which argues that pursuing economic growth through unfettered market capitalism is the best way to achieve sustainability. Next, we follow that up with the growth can be green discourse. That discourse argues more for state planning and regulations to ensure that environmental sustainability goals are being pursued. And we finished the last episode by talking about Kate Raworth and her donut economics as an example of the growth misses the point discourse, which argues that rather than pursue growth per se, we should prioritize specific social and ecological indicators that make for a prosperous society. This discourse argues that if we do that, it doesn't really matter what's happening with GDP. All right, so there's my quick summary. What are the discourses we'll be discussing today, Ryan?
Well, first, thanks, Peter, for the summary, and it's good to be recording this episode with you today. So, as I hinted in the last episode, at the end of the last episode, the 2 discourses that we're going to be discussing in this part of the series are much more actively critical of this idea of growth. And the first one is really conjured up by that opening audio clip that we heard at the outset of this episode.
Okay, great. Yeah, in that clip, I heard someone expressing, this pretty dark perspective on our society as being overconsumptive, really about a conquest rather than living within Earth's natural limits. So I'm guessing this discourse at its core is anti-colonial, anti-consumptive in some way?
Yeah, that's right. So the clip is of Winona LaDuke, who is speaking at the 1991 World Women's Congress for a Healthy Planet. And in my book, I think you'll remember I started each of the chapters with, a story of a different individual or a number of individuals that kind of introduces each discourse. And I start this chapter on the discourse I call Overthrowing Growth with the story of Winona LaDuke, who is an Indigenous activist who has come to really embrace the degrowth movement in recent years.
Oh, that's great. I was wondering if we were going to get into the degrowth perspective, this view that economic growth is fundamentally at odds with ecology and needs to be radically curtailed. I remember we first introduced listeners to this perspective back in episode 11 of season 2. Okay, so tell us more about LaDuke.
Sure. So LaDuke was born in 1959, and she grew up on the west coast of the United States with her mother, who was an artist of non-Indigenous descent. Her father, however, was a member of the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota. And in her youth, Winona would often travel there and spend a lot of time with her father and learn about Anishinaabe traditions and teachings. And one of many ideas, which would become central to her economic philosophy later in life, was this idea of Minnow B'Madaziwin, which we've actually discussed in some of our previous episodes in season 1, I believe. A bit of a refresher here. This word effectively translates to the good life or continuous rebirth. And it's an Anishinaabe concept that is relational in nature, and it's tied to honoring others, especially women as the givers of life, as well as elders and children. And it's really grounded in the places that we live, the land. So LaDuke goes on to study rural economic development. This was actually at Harvard University. And then she turns to a political career. She actually ran as a vice presidential candidate for the Green Party at one point for a U.S. presidential ticket. And then she returns to the White Earth Reservation, where she becomes quite well known for her work in community development and especially activism around water protection. So on top of co-founding the White Earth Land Recovery Project, which really was this project that was trying to buy back land, reserve land that had been sold to non-Native people, LaDuke also becomes involved in these different kinds of groups. One is empowering Native women to take on more active roles politically through the Indigenous Women's Network. And then she becomes really actively involved in the Water Protectors movement.
Yeah, I remember LaDuke's name coming up a lot over the years from the 1990s onwards. And I specifically remember her running as a vice presidential running mate for the Green Party alongside environmentalist and consumer rights advocate Ralph Nader back in 1996, I think it was. So how do LaDuke's Anishinaabe traditions and teachings relate to the growth environment debate?
Yeah, so another key construct related to Mino B'Mataziwin is LaDuke's idea of Wendigo economics. So Wendigo is the Anishinaabe word for cannibal, and Wendigo economics refers to this modern, growth-obsessed industrial capitalism, which LaDuke says is extractive, it's linear, and it really lacks humanity. You know, she kind of hints at this in that intro clip we heard. On the flip side, the economy of a society which pursues Mino B'Mataziwin would be the opposite. It would focus on, these ideals like reciprocity, cyclical systems, and respect for all living things.
That's interesting. Kate Raworth's Donut Economics also emphasized cyclicity, didn't it? So how do LaDuke and Raworth differ?
Okay, so that's a really good question. And there obviously are, some similarities in these worldviews. But of course, there are some differences. So as we'll discuss, LaDuke's school of thought and this overthrow growth discourse in general is much more explicitly critical of growth than the previous discourse, which we covered, which we called Growth Misses the Point. In LaDuke's own words, she envisions, and this is a quote, the entire restructuring of civil society and dominant economic models so that they are sustainable, end quote, or so that they're in balance with Mother Nature. So this is a fundamental restructuring, an overthrowing of the existing dominant economic system.
Okay, I get it. So, Raworth puts the emphasis on finding a way to live within the carrying capacity of the earth while meeting reasonable needs through a market economy. And so she has those two lines of the donut. LaDuke is really taking on the system as a whole, isn't she? It sounds like she's sort of an anti-capitalist activist grounded in her Anishinaabe values, traditions, and community.
Yeah, that's right. And in addition to her political activity and her activism, LaDuke is perhaps best known these days for her participation in these nonviolent direct actions to protest fossil fuel development projects and protect watersheds, these anti-pipeline protests. And a particularly high-profile example of this was her arrest on the banks of the Mississippi River back in July 2021 during a protest against Enbridge's proposed Line 3 pipeline. And she and a number of other water protectors were protesting potential leaks and ruptures in this pipeline that carries crude oil from Alberta to Wisconsin. And, these pipeline expansions for her really represent another example of how the Wendigo economy prioritizes increasing consumption really at the expense of other people's territories and their human rights.
Okay. So as I understand it, this latest discourse is about opposing pursued continual growth And you also mentioned a link to degrowth thought. So is LaDuke a degrowth activist, or is she part of that school of thought? Is overthrowing growth really about degrowth, or is this more heterogeneous, more diverse in perspective?
Well, LaDuke has embraced the language of degrowth. She was, participating at a conference on degrowth some years ago, and that was one of the reasons why I included her in that chapter. But there is this whole other discourse of degrowth, which I think we'll talk about in a few minutes. But look, there's all sorts of voices in this group, in this Overthrow Growth discourse coalition, if we can put it that way. It's not just degrowthers, but it's also an entire group of eco-Marxists that we're going to talk about as well. And generally, what brings all these diverse perspectives and members of this discourse coalition together is that they do not see a possibility for capitalist, growth-based systems to become sustainable. Fundamentally, because capitalism is inherently tied to this excessive consumption, and it necessarily draws upon extractive and neocolonial relations and growth, right? So it's a discourse that fundamentally calls for an alternative political economy, an alternative structure which overthrows growthism.
Okay, so then let's talk about degrowth. As I mentioned earlier, we did an episode on growth, degrowth, and the A-growth positions. That one featured Susan Paulson and Bengi Akbulut from Concordia University. I believe it was in season 3, right?
That sounds right.
And I know it prompted a lot of discussion in my classes. Many of the students really resonating with the degrowth perspective. So tell me more about where degrowth is going.
Yeah, I think a lot of my students as well are really compelled by this idea of degrowth. And the irony here is there's been this incredible growth of the degrowth movement. The first notable international conference on degrowth was only held back in 2008, so it's really not that long ago. And since then, there's been this explosion of work in this field, both in terms of academic publications and also material for the general public.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking as you're speaking about Canadian activist and writer Naomi Klein, her 2014 book, This Changes Everything, subtitled Capitalism versus the Climate. It's been really influential over the last 10 years in getting people, academics and students, but other members of the general public to critically reflect on the relationship between our economic system and the environment. Though I'm not sure she's explicitly a degrowther. But one name I often associate with the academic degrowth literature is Jason Hickel.
Yes, that's right. So Jason Hickel, who is the author of a book called Less is More, or How Degrowth Will Save the World, is probably the most prolific degrowth writer these days, along with Georgios Kallis. And, Hickel's really gone to great lengths to clarify degrowth's position on issues like, how does it feel about GDP? How does it differentiate between growth in the global north versus the global south? Questions about, whether degrowth is about reducing consumption primarily, or is it really focused on the realm of production? And even on the function and the purpose, the operative function of this term, degrowth, what does it do? And, he defines degrowth as, quote, a planned reduction of energy and resource throughput designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. That's an end quote. So the word throughput, I think, is pretty important in this definition because it's throughput that degrowth really seeks to reduce, not GDP per se. Though it accepts that, a reduction in GDP may very well be an outcome of degrowth, and a society therefore needs to be, designed to allow that to happen in a, quote, safe and just way. But it's important to emphasize that degrowthers are not, as they're often characterized to be doing, they're not out there saying, we need to reduce the GDP, we need to reduce the economy. That's not really the direction that they go in.
Yeah, this is really interesting, Ryan. I'm hearing both similarities and differences in how LaDuke's position was presented earlier as part of this kind of broader school of degrowth perspective. And interestingly, I'm also seeing the resonances with Kate Raworth again. One of the issues you just mentioned is this question of, is degrowth about reducing growth everywhere, including in the global south, including within communities that for equity reasons deserve, to increase their economic standing in the world. So there's always this justice and equity tension in this debate. So is degrowth targeted at everybody, or is it targeted at the global north?
Well, this is a contentious question. And degrowthers often get accused of being anti-development in the global south. They get accused of calling for a global recession, which would impoverish everyone further. But they hotly contest this. In fact, they say, we define degrowth as the antithesis of a recession. I don't know if you heard, Peter, recently there was these comments by Donald Trump about how kids will need to go without so many dolls and so many pencils because of the tariffs. Well, some have pointed to this cheekily as, Trump being a degrowther, which of course the degrowthers would say absolutely not. But anyway, there has been an extensive debate about what degrowthers actually want. What are the degrowth policies? Because, degrowth is really good at expressing what it's against, but it's been less clear about what it calls for. And so I spend a good section of the book of that chapter explaining all these different sets of degrowth policies that different degrowth authors and intellectuals have proposed. But I'll leave that for the book. I think for the podcast, we need to move on now to another subgroup, which is part of this Overthrow Discourse Coalition. And that's this subgroup of eco-Marxists, who, their critique of capitalism is tied in with a critique of growth and this concurrent call for sustainability at the same time.
And I'm glad you're bringing the eco-Marxists in here, Ryan. My sense of Marxism as a whole is that it's not always been or isn't always environmentally focused. Marxists, again, as a generalization, seem to be more concerned about who owns the means of production rather than what the means of production does to the planet. Yet, I know within Marxist thought, there's this stream of eco-Marxists who seem to be more attentive to the way that capitalism impacts the environment. But they're not necessarily degrowthers, are they?
Mm-hmm.
I remember when we had Matt Huber on this show in season 3, and he expressed a position that was critical of degrowthers, despite applying a Marxist lens himself. So what's going on here? How do we square this circle?
Well, oh boy, we could probably do a whole episode, Peter, on this question and specifically on debates within the socialist left and Marxist theory as it relates to environmental politics. But, why don't we take a little detour here and talk about this schism between the growth-critical eco-Marxists and the growth-friendly eco-modern socialists who apply a Marxist lens to their political economy. So, Peter, if Marx was around today, where do you think he would fit in this growth environment debate?
Oh, wow. That's a huge question. Okay. Let me think. As I said earlier, the Marx who wrote Capital in the mid-1800s, I think it was 1867 that it was published, sometime around then.
Mm-hmm.
He appears to be in favor of economic development for the people, controlled by the people, right? That's just a quick way of saying that for me. My sense is that the Marx of that time was not especially focused on environment, but I think the kind of critical mind that he was, if he was alive today, would be very tuned in to what appears to be a pretty strong contradiction between a growth-oriented economy on the one hand and the biophysical systems of this planet. So my guess is he'd be a pretty radical eco-Marxist if he were alive today. So that's my take. How would you answer the question?
Well, I don't know. I'm quite compelled by the eco-modernist socialists who point out that Marx's critique of capitalism was fundamentally, as you said earlier, it really was about the exploitative dynamic involved in wage labor and class relations, right? And so these eco-modernists point out that Marx was actually in some ways a celebrant of modernity, of the Industrial Revolution, of the rise of capitalism, right?
Yeah.
And in part because it was tied in with, science and technological innovation that did improve the material conditions of life for many to an extent. But, right, they clarify that Marx's problem with capitalism was that everyday workers were being exploited by virtue of the system of production, while capital made all the decisions and had the power to kind of control the economy and make all the profits. And so similarly, these, eco-modern Marxists or socialists today have a fairly positive view of growth and modernity and technological innovation in terms of its material effects and how that might improve, quality of life in material terms for people around the world. But what they object to is the social dynamic underlying it, right? Like they want it all to be democratized, and they want workers and everyday people to have a greater say and not to be exploited by the system of production.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I that's my interpretation of Marx's basic texts as well, and Marx and Engels' work and so on, that it's really attacking how the effects of capitalism on people and on the workers and class relations. But I've also heard some people say that Marx's works have an underlying kind of ecological sensibility. For example, he emphasized, in some of his ideas around alienation, the separation of people from nature as part of what happens under capitalism. Didn't he call that like the metabolic rift or something like that?
Well, there is this idea of the metabolic rift, which is from John Bellamy Foster, who is a well-known eco-Marxist theorist.
Okay, so not Marx himself. Okay.
Not Marx. Well, there's some contestation about this. Okay. Certainly, Marx, I think, wrote about the metabolism of capitalism, and anyway, we'll get back to Bellamy Foster. So he suggests that Marx had this understanding of capitalism that was ecological because of his work on this. This is the Industrial Revolution that Marx is writing about. He's immersed in the early decades of the Industrial Revolution. He's writing about the rise of factories, rapid urbanization, and he's engaging in some of these debates about how industrialization is undergirded by imperialism, right? These imperial powers that are traveling around the world to scoop up guano, bat fertilizer, right? To bring it back to Europe and to sustain this ever-growing need from an urbanized industrial working labor force, and to sustain that growth. And he's noticing, that the nutrients taken from the soil in the countryside are being shipped off to the cities in the form of food, and they're not being returned. And this leads to this kind of purported breakdown in the natural metabolic interaction between humans and urban development patterns and nature that is caused by capitalist production. Now, that's Bellamy Foster's interpretation of Marx's kind of ecological underpinnings.
That's super interesting. And in part of what you're describing, I'm hearing, again, the resonances of LaDuke, where we started. So does that make Bellamy Foster a degrowther?
Well, not quite. So he and a number of other eco-Marxists, have been pretty reticent to associate themselves with degrowth, although they're pretty sympathetic to the broader ideas. But I think they're reticent mostly because, to be blunt, it's not Marxist enough for them, And I cover some of these other eco-Marxist, currents more in the book, but, we'll have to skip them here. But suffice it to say that there's, the whole bunch of other currents of eco-Marxist thought, intellectuals like Alan Schneeberg, who came up with the treadmill of production theory, Joel Koval, and even James O'Connor, they've all expressed a criticism of capitalist accumulation. And they've based their critique of capitalism and the unsustainability of capitalism and centered their eco-criticisms of capitalism by attaching their critique to this insatiable desire for more, for accumulation, and in some ways, growth.
Okay. So we've got the eco-modernist socialists who are definitely not part of the Overgrowth Discourse Coalition and still believe in the potential of industrial society to meet needs sustainably. But then there's a bunch of eco-Marxist thinkers who are part of this Discourse Coalition. And you mentioned people like Covell and James O'Connor. And these are names that my students will have read. But they are careful, you're saying, to note that they're not degrowthers either. Is that right?
Yes. And, although most degrowthers are vehemently anti-capitalist themselves, and they may even follow Marxist thought and call themselves Marxists and socialists, they tend to be less dogmatic about what Marx himself had to say, certainly less dogmatic than the eco-Marxists, with one very notable exception.
Oh, so who's that?
So that is Kohei Saito. He is a Japanese political economist and a Marx scholar who's really been making waves with a very bold interpretation or reinterpretation of Marx, we could call it. So he goes even further than Bellamy Foster to argue that Marx wasn't just an ecological thinker, but that Marx was a degrowther. Especially in his later writings where he critiques productivism and envisions this post-capitalist society that's rooted in sustainable communal living. So Saito calls this vision degrowth communism.
Oh, that's super interesting. So I've only heard about Saito in the last few years. I gather he's still in his 30s, but he seems to be well read. Like that book that he came out with in 2020, Capital in the Anthropocene, really made waves and sold, hundreds of thousands of copies. So clearly the degrowth movement is, growing. So what I'm hearing from you, Ryan, is that despite featuring a range of different proposals and schools of thought, the Overthrow Growth discourse ultimately views growth as a primary problem for the global environment and really how that's structured under capitalism. And I guess we might say that if the growth misses the point discourse that we covered at the end of part 1 was too controversial for politicians, I remember we talked about that, I can't see mainstream political candidates approaching the overthrow discourse very easily, can you? I mean, this is a tough position to take. Let's shrink our economy.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly a common criticism, that this discourse isn't politically realistic. And another criticism is that this is simply just a bad idea, specifically that degrowth or eco-Marxism would ruin the economy and our society and ultimately the environment too, as people scramble to survive. Though, of course, the people who are proponents of the overthrow growth discourse would vehemently disagree with this and defend their perspectives. But anyway, this vision of social breakdown might actually be a good segue, albeit an ominous segue, to the final discourse that I cover in my book, which we should discuss now.
All right. So I've been wondering where this is going. So your book has run the gamut from pro to agnostic to anti-growth perspectives. But where are we going with this last discourse?
The weather has already changed and will continue to do so in ways that destabilize both wild nature and agriculture. There is crying to come. There is dismay. There is despair. There is anger. But then after that, it's worth remembering that we aren't in imminent danger. There's no need for a panicked response. We have some years ahead of us. But that doesn't mean we can get out of this. I think we won't. By that I mean we're likely to experience exorbitant prices, shortages of necessities, reactionary and authoritarian politics, bouts of civil unrest, and international wars that will result from such stresses.
That is pretty dark, Ryan. Let me tell the listeners that clip you just played is from the opening of a 1-hour TV documentary on collapse readiness that can be found on YouTube. This is an excerpt read by Jem Bendell, reading from his book, Breaking Together. So can you tell us who is Jem Bendell and what is this final discourse you're going to tell us about?
Mm-hmm. Well, I pronounce it Bendel, but I guess we'll have to ask him what the proper pronunciation is. But maybe it's appropriate to tell you about the before and after versions of Jem Bendell. So in the before times, back in the early 2000s, Bendell was a high-flying academic from the UK who had become a bit of a celebrity in the world of, business and sustainable finance. So think of an academic who's produced over 100 publications, who's worked with the UN and other international organizations and the corporate sector and given TED Talks to a room full of professionals who, likely agree with this idea that growth is, or at least can be, green. So this is the kind of guy who might win the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader Award for work on sustainable business alliances, which he did, in fact, actually win in 2012.
I was going to say, the way you describe him, this really sounds like the kind of guy who'd be invited to the World Economic Forum. But based on the directions of this, what we just heard from him, he obviously went through a major kind of life transition. What happened to him?
Yeah, so then there's the after version of Bendell. And I think this aha moment was more of an aha year. So he writes about how he took a year off, an unpaid year off from his academic position to essentially hang out in Bali and dive deeper into the scientific literature on climate change, which was really worrying him at the time. And after a year of study on the science of climate change and also the economic and policy implications and social implications, Bendell, came to a startling conclusion. And in his words, he realized, quote, it was already too late to prevent both catastrophic change to human societies and the inevitable collapse of the industrial consumer way of life, end quote. In other words, until that point in his career, Bendell had preached to the importance of acting before it's too late, to this kind of vision of sustainable growth that we had talked about earlier. But now he was convinced that it was too late and that unavoidable collapse had already begun.
Interesting. And, I sometimes think about spending a year like that, just reading that kind of literature. And I can imagine it's pretty daunting. So what happened with him after he came to this sort of existential crisis-induced conclusion?
Well, for Bendell, he did what he knew best at the time. He prepared to share his findings with the academic community in a journal article. However, this paper submission was rejected by the journals that he submitted it to, and the reviewers were saying, this didn't offer novel results and it's inappropriate material for peer-reviewed academia. And so he pivoted, and instead he decided to post a free, non-academic jargony version of this work online in this sort of treatise that he called Deep Adaptation, a Map for Navigating Climate Tragedy. And, you were talking earlier about how Kohei Saito's work gained, 500,000 sales, and this document that Bendell posted also had a viral response with over 1 million downloads so far of this document. And since collapse was unavoidable in his view, Bendell really emphasized that we should start preparing for it. He suggested this deep adaptation agenda organized around these 4R principles: resilience, relinquishment, restoration, and reconciliation.
That's really interesting. I know that within the environmentalist communities that I'm part of, there's both individuals who are prepping for sort of a post-apocalyptic future, homesteading and figuring out how to grow their own food and build their own houses and generate their own energy and that kind of thing. And there's also a growing sort of self-help movement happening at a community level where people are really kind of figuring out how to be supportive of neighbors, say when the power goes out, both short-term, but also maybe long-term, right? So that's all part of this, isn't it? So going back to the growth environment debate, is this a discourse that says we're already in the collapse?
Yeah, and I think the key point about the growth environment debate is that, unlike the degrowthers and eco-Marxists that we covered in the previous discourse, who can essentially argue that it's not too late, right? We can reverse course through revolution or, eco-socialist policies. But these folks say, no, it's simply not enough to do that. It's too late to turn the ship around. because we've already hit the iceberg, so to speak. And this is, again, why I call this discourse, the damage of growth is done. It's too late to do anything about growth. So to borrow a colorful quote from Bendell's most recent book, which is called Breaking Together, he says, quote, "The fact that economic growth became God is one of the reasons why humanity is, to get a bit technical, so exponentially effed."
Okay, right. But he's not the only one who's been talking like this. When I think back to Paul Ehrlich in part 1 of this series, he also made some pretty dramatic predictions about ecological collapse due to growing human populations and the way our societies operate, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Ehrlich is a great example of an early thinker in this school of thought that we call human ecology, which, in the 1970s was still issuing these warnings that we need to decrease human population size or else, right? But today, that same school is warning similarly about the imminence of collapse. The time frame is shifted, but there's still a similar kind of concern about being beyond the limits of growth. So human ecology, this school of thought, is a really important part of this discourse coalition. And much of the logic is based on this idea of overshoot, which is an idea that was, developed by the human ecologist William Catton, which essentially means that we're over-consuming natural resources and producing waste at such rates that are faster than they can be replenished and processed by the natural environment. So the basic math of overshoot indicates that these conditions can't last forever. Nothing grows forever. Literally nothing you can think of, including the sun or presumably our universe, will grow forever. At some point, it cannot continue.
Okay. But I can see some of the more techno-optimistic people that we've been listening to arguing, while that may be, theoretically true, in the big picture, we're so innovative. Humans are innovative. We're constantly coming up with new ways to produce or substitute resources and dispose of waste more efficiently. So, we can prevail through even these challenging times.
For sure. And that, brings us back to that Ehrlich-Simon debate that we talked about in part 1. But according to the folks in this discourse coalition, these temporary fixes only really serve to buy us more time before the inevitability of ecological collapse. And they really see this coming sooner than later. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, Bendell says we're already in that phase. That period of collapse has already started.
Okay. So if we take this position seriously, and you talked about his 4 R's and you touched on this idea of deep adaptation. So Bendell's claim is that we should focus our energy on preparing for this collapse, right? That he says we're already in, instead of trying to prevent it. But isn't there a risk that people will just give up or descend into a sort of an every person for themselves mentality? It's not really an inspiring call to action, is it?
Well, that's definitely one of the most common criticisms of this discourse. And, I'll touch on some of the more troubling implications of this line of thinking in a moment. But, Bendell has come to point to what he calls eco-libertarianism as a rebuke of this individualist impulse. And I know it's a bit of a strange term because of the connotation of libertarianism elsewhere. So, but the key thing here is that Bendell's eco-libertarianism is not your usual right-leaning libertarianism, but rather it's based on the freedom to be a caring individual and a member of a collective society, freed from the shackles of this industrial consumerist world, right? Which he argues that, is actually coercive, and it manipulates us all to behave in ways that are anti-ecological, just buying more and more and being inattentive to the ecological consequences of growth. So simply put, he says we should be free to work together to build the foundations for a gentler and fairer collapse, which again is inevitable, but one that's outside the confines of capitalist society. Bendell himself now actually lives a very simple life as, a small-scale seaweed and agroforestry farmer in Indonesia.
Okay, I get where he's going here, and implicit is a critique of, the people who, in response to collapse, are just trying to build their own little fiefdom with barbed wire fences around it. Because it sounds like he's really saying, as we prepare for a post-industrial future, where this society and a lot of its kind of mechanisms have broken down, we've got to do that together, right?
Yeah. It's a more communal view of that kind of vision, right?
So is he a survivalist or a prepper? These are words that the listeners might know.
Well, there's definitely been a resurgence of what we might call survivalism. And this is a worldview which emerged in the 1970s when the monetary supply and inflation crisis was picking up, and there was fears of nuclear apocalypse and some of that Ehrlich infused fear of population growth and the famines that this would contribute to. And people were moving out to the countryside and, again, taking on this survivalist perspective, which we might call prepperism today. There's a few different stripes to this modern neo-survivalist movement, including some of these more holistic back to the land communities, which are focused on self-sufficiency and, producing regenerative food. But of course, there are also really militant versions of prepperism, which kind of relate to your earlier point about everyone fending for themselves in this apocalyptic Hollywood type, scenario. In fact, there's this one part in the US called The Great Readout, where people are buying up land and, turning to farming and stocking up on ammunition. And, it's really this kind of fortress type mentality where you're going to protect your supply and your family and yourself from the ravages of collapse that they see as inevitable.
Yeah, this is super interesting. When I was in New Zealand back during COVID 2020, there was a whole wave of wealthy people from around the world who were suddenly trying to buy land there, seeing the COVID pandemic as, another sign of it's time to retreat and build your own little fortress in a safe part of the world. It seems like this has been one long-standing reaction to moments of crisis, and it's interesting to kind of think about the discourse in that way. Okay, so let's recap a little bit here. In this series, the 2 episodes, we've heard 5 main discourses that are in a debate with each other, and in some cases within the discourse coalition, about what the true relationship is between growth and the environment. So we heard about Dana and Dennis Meadows, who helped launch this debate back in the 1970s with their Limits to Growth report. Then we learned about Julian Simon, who critiqued Paul Ehrlich, and that debate that they had and the bet came to encapsulate the growth is green response to the proposed incompatibility between growth and the environment. And we have to remember that Simon won that debate. Then we met Mustafa Tolba. He worked for the United Nations Environment Program, and that helped us understand the growth can be green discourse, right? And with the help of guardrails on the economy through the state and regulation, we can make a greener world in a way that continues to grow economically. And then Kate Raworth, her donut economics helped frame the idea that maybe the debate about growth kind of misses the point, right? That we need to be looking at other indicators to see if our society is successful and on the right track. And then today we learned about the degrowthers and eco-Marxists and Indigenous anti-extractivist activists like Winona LaDuke. They want to overthrow growth. And finally, there's folks like Jem Bendell who come to believe that it's really too late. The damage of growth is done.
Well, Peter, you were really paying attention, weren't you?
Well, I guess that's part of my job. And I'm sure the listeners were paying attention too. And so they're probably wondering about what you do with these positions. Like, what do you make of the growth environment debate, Ryan? After reading about all of these different perspectives, organizing them, how do you conclude the book? Where do you land yourself?
Well, I try not to advocate one particular discourse. And, at the end of the book, I have a little questionnaire that readers can use to place themselves in this debate and see, where they spend most of their time. But I do have a few takeaways on this debate, some of which I can elaborate here. The first one is that, it's important to note that there are actually multiple growth environment debates. It's not just one debate. There are debates about population growth. There's debates about economic growth. There's about material growth, about capital accumulation, about growth in the money supply, and so on. And, these are all distinct forms of this broader debate, distinct forms of a debate about how things that are growing relate with the ecology and our sustainable environment. And so there are different understandings of growth, and there's different understandings of ecology and what sustainability is. And so this is really a complex and multifaceted debate.
Yeah, fair enough. So there is not just one growth environment debate. Okay, so what's your second key takeaway here?
Well, one second thing that we can elaborate on is that, I think these discourses all make some compelling claims to justify their worldview. So, for instance, there are really remarkable examples of technological substitution and innovation, which support some of the claims that the growth is green and the growth can be green discourses make. But I actually think there's also evidence and examples involving the limits of absolute material decoupling, this idea of planetary boundaries that are being surpassed, and even some early warning signs of, increasing death rates in some wealthy economies and declining sustainable development goals, which I think is, these are bits of evidence that are used by the Overthrow Growth and the Damage of Growth is Done discourse coalitions. But, some of that is compelling evidence to me. So personally, I don't think we're on the brink of a global societal collapse event, the kind of Hollywood style collapse where everything kind of just ends overnight. But I do think that growth increases the likelihood in some circumstances of conflict. It increases the likelihood of tension, political tension over resource use. It increases the likelihood of dangerous ecological impacts. But just as at the same time, it may also simultaneously increase the likelihood that humans may have the resources and the wealth to innovate and come up with breakthrough technology. So I guess the overall takeaway there is that, and I explain this a little bit further in the book, is that there's a little bit of a paradox because growth can be good in many respects, but it can also be damaging to our future prospects for sustainability in the long run. And it's this paradox that I think drives this debate.
That's a fascinating conclusion, Ryan. As I was listening to you, I have to say I was a little bit resistant at first to the idea that all the discourses are a little bit right. But I think you make a good case for, the evidence that is coming forward that can support each of these discourses and their underlying assumptions. The other thing that I was thinking, though, is, and this really came to me working on this episode over these two episodes with you, is that the indicator of GDP is just so simplistic and problematic. And I know that's not the only way to talk about growth, but it's still one that we hear in the news regularly. The country's GDP is up at this level, or that country's GDP is at that level. And we really need to be talking about a wider set of indicators when we talk about growth, so that we can have kind of a meaningful discussion about what it means for our relationship with this planet, right?
Well, I'd agree with that point. And I think it leads to the third point, I think the third takeaway here, which is that contrary to what we might expect, this debate really isn't going to be resolved. The idea that limits to growth models will be proven right, shortly, or wrong for that matter, it really seems unlikely to me after reading the debate and the complexities involved in the contours of that debate. I think, and I predict, that we're most likely going to see arguments restructured to fit the new evidence rather than a clear winner to this debate. And in fact, we saw this earlier after Paul Ehrlich's doomsday findings in the 1970s. You know, it's 50 years ago, he was making claims about what would happen. And they didn't come true. He lost the debate with Julian Simon. But to this day, Peter, he still argues that collapse is inevitable, that Earth's carrying capacity is around 2 billion people, and that a correction is, imminent. And this perspective is widely shared and has seen a significant resurgence in recent years. And so to me, that just shows that this debate is not going to be resolved anytime soon.
Well, it sounds like you'll have plenty of material for a second edition in a couple of years there, Ryan.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Well, Ryan, I really appreciate you sharing your book with me and our listeners in these 2 episodes of the podcast. And I think this is a great place to end the discussion, at least between you and I, in this medium, and to allow the discussion to continue among the listeners. And anybody who's interested, you can acquire Ryan's book from many book retailers of your choice. And make sure you listen to part 1 of the series to kind of get the full picture of the 5 discourses. And of course, listen to all of the episodes in our 4 seasons. There's lots of interesting material out there. And we'll link in our supplementary materials to some of the episodes that we specifically deal with these questions.
Thanks, Peter. And as always, we should probably take some time to thank our production team, our funders, and our listeners. The Ecopolitics Podcast Season 4 is produced by Kaylee McIntosh, edited by Nicole Bedford, and our IT tech guru and digital art designer is Adam Gibbard. Don't forget to check out our website and see all the amazing artwork that Adam is producing for each episode. And a thank you to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which made this episode and this series possible, thanks to their funding. I'd also like to thank Isaac Bell for his support in preparing these 2 episodes. Get in touch with either myself or Peter if you have any feedback on the podcast, suggestions, or you just want to share your support for the show. We love to hear about colleagues and students using these resources, so please don't hesitate to get in touch. See you next time.